In this brief tutorial, we're going to look at adding motion blur to quickly moving objects. And Element makes this very easy for you, which is why it's going to be a brief tutorial. So we looked before at this shattering glass object, and we saw this steel ball coming in. And what adds a lot to the realism is this motion blur. And we can see if we go over to the motion blur composition that it does not have that motion blur. Now, especially if this were at 24 frames per second, which is actually how I usually work, this would be really unrealistic. There would be some strobing in that, and it would not look very good. In this example, we might get away with that just because it's like a really kind of like hyper real example anyways. But let's look at how to add motion blur. There's really two ways. If we select Element and go into Render Settings, we can open up motion blur. And by default, the settings are comp settings. So if we just enable motion blur for the layer that Element is on and for the composition, we'll have that motion blur. Now, if I wanted to make this even simpler, I can just turn motion blur on in Element, and I don't have to enable it for the comp or the layer, and it automatically turns it on for me. It also gives me access very quickly to the two most important attributes of motion blur, samples and shutter angle. So if I wanted more samples here, I could bump this up to, let's say, 20, and now we don't have that stutter that we did before. We have a much smoother motion blur. If we didn't want to adjust samples or shutter angle from this section here, we'd have to go over to the right-hand side of the screen here, go to Composition Settings, go to Advanced, and then adjust samples per frame and shutter angle here. And then every time we wanted to make any kind of tweak to these settings, we'd have to go back into the Composition Settings dialog box, go back to the Advanced tab, blah, blah, blah. And it's just not a very efficient way to work. So Element removes all that for us and allows us to adjust these key parameters right here from in the Element interface. So whether you want to just use the composition settings or force it to be on or turn it off entirely, the choice is right here inside of Element.